Awesome, then let's start back up with our second panel of the conference, affectionately titled Chocolate, Aliens, and Football, oh my, an homage to the Wizard of Oz line. But we're not scared of this work. We're not in the jungle, terrified of these pieces of work. I'm very excited. I exerted whatever chair authority I actually have in order to be sitting here at this table because I'm so excited about these three very novel lines of research. So before we begin, incredibly fortunate to have Dr. Lisa Sundstrom as discussant for our second panel, bringing her expertise in international relations, comparative politics, to our panelists. Lisa joined the department in 2002, completing her PhD at Stanford University. Her regional area of expertise is Russia and the former Soviet Union, and she's conducted extensive research on democratization, human rights, gender, and NGO activism in both domestic and transnational politics. Dr. Sundstrom has authored several books, including her most recent work, co-authored with Laura Henry at Bowdoin College, titled Bringing Global Governance Home, NGO Mediation, and the BRICS States. B-R-I-C-S States? Those pesky acronyms, to read it out loud or not. This book explores the engagement of NGOs from the BRICS countries in key global governance initiatives and the interplay of international and domestic factors that allow domestically rooted NGOs to participate globally. So thank you again for being here. We're excited about this. At the far end, we got Thomas Calvié. Thomas is an MA student in the Department of Political Science here. He holds Joint Honors BA in Political Science and International Development from McGill University. Originally from France, Thomas's field of interest is international relations. More specifically, his work is at the intersection between international human rights and environmental justice. In this sense, he's currently exploring emerging non-state actors in global politics and their role, capacity, and duty in the promotion of international norms. Beyond this, his areas of research include Latin American politics, international law, transitional justice, and quantitative research methods. Next to him is the incomparable Philippe Granger, an MA student originally from Montreal, Quebec. Just ask him, he'll tell you. He holds a bachelor's degree in international relations and international law from the University of Quebec, Montreal, UQAM, where he obtained a certificate in Indigenous Studies. Beyond his studies, interestingly, Philippe is a journalist for Radio-Canada, the LGBTQ+ magazine Cubes, and the music webzine Sortu.ca. Torn between arts and politics, two fields he often likes to confuse. Philippe dreams to become a writer and was a finalist for the Radio-Canada Short Story Prize in 2021 for his short story Rum and Coke. He's actively involved in lowering the voting age to 16 in Quebec and expected to publish a book on the matter next year. And then next to me, the wonderful Katherine Poole UBC. Katherine is an MA student in the department here, where she also completed her BA in International Relations. She's originally from Guatemala. In between her BA and MA, she worked at the European Commission in Luxembourg in the Health Security Unit, dealing with COVID-related matters. Her areas of interest are varied, including drug trafficking in Latin America, artificial intelligence, as we saw this morning, international development, and more recently, the political economy of chocolate, which is what we'll be hearing a bit about today. Let's turn it over to these fantastic presentations, starting with Thomas.
Thank you, Kel, for the introduction. So today I will be presenting on Beyond FIFA's Cosmetic Human Rights Agenda. It's an analysis of the Federation human rights reforms. In this paper, I not only review the reforms the FIFA has done in terms of human rights, but I also try to identify the position of the Federation in global politics. And I want to thank Professor Lisa Sundstrom for her help and guidance during the exploration of this topic, which can hopefully evolve into my thesis. First, I will introduce the rationale behind the choice of the topic. Then second, I will discuss the trilemma, that is the nature of FIFA as a non-state actor. And then I will switch into the analysis of FIFA's human rights agenda by presenting the recommendations done by John Ruggie in his reports, FIFA and Human Rights. And I will contrast them with the actual reforms FIFA did. Lastly, I will provide concluding remarks and potential avenues for further exploration of the topic. So in this paper, I argued that FIFA's effort to incorporate human rights principle into its agenda has been effective to actually grasp the standards and procedures related to good practice of international human rights, as recommended in Ruggie's report. Additionally, I argued that looking at FIFA through a human rights lens can facilitate our understanding of its nature and demonstrates how it has behaved in light of international scrutiny, and also the evolution of international norms for the promotion of human rights practice.
We had one. Oh, there we go.
So it is not secret that FIFA has been implicated in numerous cases of human rights violations, from turning a blind eye to regime with poor human rights records, to the lack of commitment by its governing body to address the role of FIFA in the perpetuation of violation. So there's no shortage of allegation against the federation, but the most salient issues have been linked to for example, the hundreds of thousands of migrant workers dying during the construction of infrastructure for the Qatar World Cup, but also the forced evictions to make space for infrastructures and restriction of citizens and journalists' freedom of expression. So FIFA now governs over 210 national football associations, which is more than any other international organization in global governance. To do so, FIFA has been using the power of football, which it sees football as being an ideal vehicle through which urban male and working class communities have organized their own culture, and countries have symbolized their proudness and superiority. The growth of FIFA has been triggered by the rise of broadcasting revenues linked to the events, which in turn triggered merchandising and branding opportunities for sponsors and other suppliers of goods. This has happened both nationally and internationally. So I show that this immense growth signals the unique position of FIFA and football in promoting both cultural and economic relations across the world. And given FIFA's unique role in global politics, it becomes crucial to understand the nature of its position as a non-state actor. And currently, the literature has been a bit ambiguous on the nature of FIFA, and it has been referred to and analyzed as both an international organization with the authority to govern football across the globe, but it also has been referred to as a non-profit organization. And lastly, it's also been looked at as a transnational private actor. So in this paper, what I tried to do is,
Okay, I guess we got a few uses out of that then.
So I looked at many evidence to try to define what FIFA is. So first, I looked at FIFA as a nonprofit organization. So this idea of looking at nonprofit organization as FIFA as a nonprofit comes from its status, which states that it's registered under the commercial register under Article 60 of the Swiss Civil Code. As well, I looked at the organizational structure of FIFA, and shows that it respects the Swiss code in terms of the organization of nonprofits. Then I looked at FIFA as an international organization. So basically this idea came because it's been referred to as the international body for the development and the administration of football, with the authority as per Article 2 to regulate football, ensure the enforcement, and control every type of football association across the world. Lastly, I presented that looking at FIFA through a human rights lens can be helpful because it does signal FIFA as a transnational actor than anything else. For example, one crucial piece of evidence that I look at is the FIFA adopting the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, which both signals that FIFA and the UN perceive FIFA as a private actor. And lastly, I also looked at the public-private partnerships that FIFA has been doing with international organizations. So for example, there's the UNESCO. But interestingly, last semester, I virtually attended the WTO World Summit, and it was a crucial panel of the forum, which was FIFA and the WTO. So now I'm just gonna quickly go through the key recommendations that were done by Ruggie in his reports. So first recommendation for FIFA is to adopt a clear and coherent human rights policy and reflect it in its binding documents. So to do so, FIFA had to review its codes and its codes of conduct and ethics, but also its law of the game, and in order to reflect its commitment to human rights. Second, FIFA had to embed respect for human rights. So this recommendation is for FIFA to establish formal structures for engagement with key stakeholders and ensure human rights compliance with its activities, but also with its member. Then Ruggie states that FIFA needs to address the human rights risk that its partnership and its events might lead to. So, for example, FIFA should have explicit human rights requirements, criteria for evaluating bids from country to host a World Cup, and finally, engage with host governments in terms of human rights. Then Ruggie talks about enabling access to remedy. So in this sense, he recommends FIFA to adopt a grievance mechanism that should both be publicly available and advertised during FIFA's event. For example, FIFA should allow attendees of World Cup to report anything that they might see or experience themselves. Then Ruggie says that FIFA needs to identify and evaluate the human rights risk. So in this sense, FIFA's risk assessments and interaction with community should be at the core principle of any events led by FIFA. And finally, FIFA should track and report the implementations that they're doing. So in this sense, it should increase transparency, also review its activity report that it submits every year, and it should adopt the UN guiding principle, which it did. Okay, next slide. So now I will present the 4 reforms that I looked into to see how FIFA has adopted Ruggie's recommendations. So first, it is the FIFA 2017 Human Rights Policy, which basically is the direct commitment of FIFA for human rights and everything that it will do, but also will change within its governance and operations. So then there's the FIFA Human Rights Advisory Board, which is a group of independent experts who provide advice and guidance to FIFA on how to address human rights risk associated with its operation. Then I also look at the FIFA Human Rights Stakeholder Engagement Report, which is a document that outlines the steps FIFA has taken to engage with stakeholders in where it's going to put an event. And the report provides an overview of the engagement process, but also highlights the key concern raised by its stakeholders. Lastly, the reforms that I looked into was FIFA's grievance mechanism, which is a formal process for individuals and groups to report human rights violation related to FIFA's activity. And it provides a way for people to raise concerns of human rights abuses. So my findings, so I find that FIFA has actually successfully implemented John Ruggie's recommendations through the reforms that I presented. However, there are crucial points that FIFA still needs to engage with and adopt. First, FIFA needs to update its code of ethics and disciplinary code to further commit to its human rights agenda. Then FIFA needs to directly engage with vulnerable communities and individuals to understand their concern and experiences. And that finding comes from because the stakeholder engagement report is done externally than FIFA, so there's no real engagement with FIFA. And lastly, FIFA needs to address the issue of human rights expertise in its dispute process to ensure fair and just resolutions. So the current FIFA dispute process is done through an independent court. I can't remember the name, but it's the Court of Arbitration in Switzerland, and there's no expertise on human rights in this with the court. But there's been scholars mentioning that FIFA could actually engage with the European Court of Human Rights to address disputes. Finally, so my paper is just the start of this idea. So I haven't provided any empirical evidence, which is crucial to determine the extent to which FIFA is actually upholding those reforms. But overall, in its governance, FIFA has adopted good practice for human rights.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for starting us off, Thomas. Let's move to outer space.
Well, since you seem to suggest that I didn't talk enough about Montreal during the, so I could, if I can take my 15 minutes.
It's essentially outer space.
Oh yeah, it's yeah, basically the same. So hi everybody. So today I'm going to present my paper, which is called "When Science Fiction Will Become Reality: Global Political Considerations on an Extraterrestrial Discovery." So basically, I did a paper for Yves Bergen's class last term on global governance and crisis, and I really got passionate with this topic, so I decided to expand it on a MA thesis. So far, what I will show you is the findings I've done for this last paper, but please note that it's still a work in progress, and I will work more thoroughly on it with Yves during the next months. So we can go to the next slides, or am I trying with this?
Try, see if you can get that to work.
No.
No dice. All right, here we go.
All right, so I think that if I talk to you about extraterrestrials, the first things that come to mind are like the little green humanoids people, like all these movies that you've probably seen, or those books you've read. And actually, like the kind of circle that was on the slide before was actually from the movie Arrival from Vélo Québécois Denis Villeneuve, a movie that I really love. And so, yeah, obviously you can think of that, but actually, you can go to the next slide. When we think about extraterrestrial discovery, we have to think further than, little green humanoids. It can be, I gave other examples of what can happen in terms of humanity when we think about that. But for example, it can be a private company that discovers some bacteria, like what happens if Elon Musk says like, oh, I found some extraterrestrial bacteria, like who owns this data? And the reception of signals from light years away, we know that there's a lot of work done by scientists right now to try to receive, but also to send some signals for outer space. So this paper explores what has been done in the political science sphere and international organizations in regards to the handling of an extraterrestrial discovery. And this handling raises some questions such as what role do scientists do, how to proceed, what role does the UN hold, how to inform the public. Well, and I think most importantly, who owns the data? Because I think that there will be kind of a fight for the data and like how to handle all the information we got on extraterrestrial people. Because, and then you may think, okay, but it seems quite speculative. Like, why are we talking about this right now? The thing is, despite what the professor told me, like the professor basically told me in the department that I was wrong, but there's actually a NASA head scientist that have said that there will be within 30 years, there will be strong evidence of life elsewhere. So we must get ready, I think. Well, at least we must see what's been done to get ready for this discovery in this regards. And so we can go to the next slide. And so in the political science field, so far it's been quite limited what has been done. There's been a few articles that were kind of exploring what were the frameworks that have been settled for the moment, but once again, it's really limited. The paper I wanted to underline was the Baum, Axe, Misra, and Domagal Goldman papers that kind of underline the complexity of such a research. So what they do basically is that they kind of see how an extraterrestrial discovery either it's, as I said, green humanoids that come to Earth or rediscover bacteria, how it can affect in a beneficial way, in a neutral way, and in a harmful way humanity. So obviously in my paper, I won't explore all these scenarios. It would be long and really speculative. What I will really see is to see what can be done in terms of agreements, what are the limitations of these kinds of agreements, since it's a really complex and speculative field, since we don't know how and on which form it will take place, this kind of discoveries. So, I think that this kind of literature already kind of could support a framework in this regard. So the Baum, Misra, and Domagal Goldman text joins a really limited literature, and in this literature there's the text The Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, a Real Politic Consideration by Kenneth Wiesian and John Traphagen. And so they use the prism of realpolitik, which they consider most likely, to reach the conclusion that, and now I'm quoting, there is a measurable risk of conflict over the perceived benefit of monopolistic access to extraterrestrial information communication channels. And so they argue that make the control of communication with an extraterrestrial intelligence would be the biggest prize ever won in international competition. Yet this writing from Wiesian and Traphagen is highly contested, and actually a recent paper by Wright, Aramia, and Sweeney contested this and actually rejected Wiesian and Traphagen's vision of how the information would be managed, and they estimate that the likelihood of an actual information monopoly is low. So basically Wright, Aramia, and Sweeney recommend transparency and data sharing, which are consistent with currently accepted best practices, and further development of post-detection protocols and better education of policymakers in this space. So, as you may see, even if there's a limited literature in political science, even the limited literature is quite conflictory. There's no real consensus and agreement, and it's a bit scattered, let's be honest. But there are still some other interesting writings also in other fields, such as history, sociology. There are some interesting writings, for example, Zbigniew Papot's text, Signals from ETI Detected, What Next? In this text, he establishes the three main factors that will influence the decision-making process following the discovery of extraterrestrial intelligence, which is the readiness to accept the fact of ETI detection, the methods of releasing the news of detection, and the comprehensiveness of the signal's message. So now that I've explored what the political science field have said, I'm gonna more explore further on what's been said in the actual international sphere, in international institutions regarding this matter. We can go to the next. So there's been the Treaty on Principles Governing the Activities of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, including the Moon and other celestial bodies, which was signed in 1967. It's also called the Outer Space Treaty. And so many, if not all, countries with a strong space industry, such as the United States, Russia, China, India, the United Kingdom, France, and Canada have ratified the agreement. And so basically it prescribes how to act in the case of the discovery of any phenomena in outer space, including the Moon and other celestial bodies, which, and this is quite important, which could constitute a danger to the life or health of astronauts. So even if the extraterrestrials are not specifically, explicitly underlined in this agreement, we could consider that maybe an extraterrestrial life could constitute a danger to the life or health of astronauts. So in some kind of way, we could include this text, this agreement, as being one of the framework that could be applied in case of an extraterrestrial discovery. The article, actually, Article 5 also states that states parties to the treaty shall regard astronauts as envoys of mankind in outer space and shall render to them all possible assistance in the event of accident, distress, or emergency landing. The thing is, if we say that they are envoys of mankind, it kind of reflects the fact that it's envoys of mankind to someone else, to another being that is not part of mankind. So there's a legal expert from Austria, his name is Ernest Fassin. He's kind of says that when speaking of astronauts as envoys of mankind, it immediately raises the questions of envoys to whom. So we could say that for this text, this document, it doesn't, as I said, it doesn't explicitly talk about extraterrestrial life, but it can still be applied since in an indirect way talks about what would happen if astronauts are harmed or face a danger. We can go to the next slide. There is then the agreement governing the activities of states on the moon and other celestial bodies, which was signed in 1979. It's called the Moon Treaty. And so, as you may see, there are 18 countries, which we see out there, that have ratified the document. And I will go quickly through the countries, but you will probably notice something. Armenia, Australia, Austria, Belgium, Chile, Kazakhstan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Mexico, Morocco, the Netherlands, Pakistan, Peru, Philippines, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Uruguay, and Venezuela. There's also France, Guatemala, India, and Romania that have signed the treaty but didn't ratify it. So as you may have noticed, there are no really big countries with spatial force, except maybe France, who signed it but didn't ratify, or Australia. So there's not China, the United States, there is not Russia. So there are a lot of big spatial forces that are missing. India, who signed but didn't ratify as well. And so, but yet, what's interesting about this document is that it actually underlines the probability of extraterrestrial life. It says at Article 5.3 of this treaty, in carrying out activities under this agreement, states parties shall promptly inform the Secretary General, as well as the public and the international scientific community, of any phenomena they discover in outer space, including the moon, which could endanger human life or health, as well as of any indication of organic life. So it's this last part that underlines, as well as of any indication of organic life, that is quite important and quite innovative in this field. But actually, the fact that yes, it's a UN agreement, but the fact that it's only signed by 18 countries really limits the scope of this agreement. The last agreement we can go to the next. The last agreement I will explore is the Declaration of Principles concerning activities following the detection of extraterrestrial intelligence, which was, I will say, signed in 1999. It's also known as the first protocol. The thing about this document is that it's not a UN document. It's actually a document from the International Academy of Astronautics, which is an international organization that was created in 1960 and that brings together experts in the field of astronomy from around the world. And it also collaborates with academies of science, such as the Academies of Arts, Humanities, and Sciences of Canada. So this document actually explores in a really more thorough way the possibility of an extraterrestrial discovery. And so it's outlined, it's divided into 9 articles, and it says basically the procedures that should be followed by the scientific community in the event of a discovery of extraterrestrial intelligence. And so I won't go with all the articles, but I will give, for example, the Article 2 that says that the discoverer should promptly inform all other observers or research organizations that are parties to this declaration before making a public announcement. Or there's also the Article 4 that says that confirmed detection of extraterrestrial intelligence should be disseminated promptly, openly, and widely through scientific channels and public media. And there's also the fact, for example, Article 4 that says that the discoverer should have the privilege of making the first public announcement. So it's quite precise. So despite being an organization recognized by the UN, the International Academy of Astronautics is not a UN body, so it really limits the scope of the binding part of what usually we look for in a international agreement. So it has a voluntary basis that makes it and so it doesn't make the protocol particularly robust. So we can go to the next. So basically, inside of all these findings, the paper for Eve last term, what I did was to underline some recommendations. And for example, I took the example of the pandemic, the COVID-19 crisis, to see on how governments and how the public may react sometimes in sharing and not sharing the information. So I came with recommendations, but I must say that for my MA thesis, I will probably not go on with recommendations, but I would still wanted to share it with you. And I will probably go on with another approach. So this is why I wrote in questions. And so I will go on with more of what can be, in what way can we structure a new international framework regarding extraterrestrial discovery inside of what has already been done. So what does the genesis and content of existing international frameworks tell us? And what elements could be relevant to the development of an international framework for extraterrestrial discovery? So that's it for my presentation.
Thank you, Philippe. Okay, moving on to Catherine last for last
Yeah.
presentation of this panel.
So two things, Brent, sorry, you're gonna have to be quick and a lot.
Yeah.
And I mean, what's better than one Catherine presenting in a day? It's two Catherine presenting. And on very broad topics. So I'm gonna be talking about chocolate manufacturing companies and voluntary sustainability initiatives. I was interested in this idea of what is being bar in the industry, especially with companies saying they can track back where the chocolate bar, or where the beans come from. So basically for the presentation, I'm going to be talking about some of the main aspects of the cocoa supply chain, the theoretical framework I've used, and some preliminary findings and limitations. I plan on writing or expanding this for my MA thesis. There's a lot. I've been talking to everyone. Thank you to my parents who are online for putting up with all the talks on how to narrow this down. So this is my first attempt. We'll go to the chocolate supply chain, some key facts and figures to begin with, where are cocoa beans produced. So you'll see eventually, sorry, it's an interactive. So if you can see behind me, this is information from the International Cocoa Organization. So 70% of all cocoa beans are produced in West Africa. The more striking statistic here is that 60% of all cocoa beans come from two countries alone, that's Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. And then the rest, you can see there's some coming from the Americas, specifically from Ecuador. That is growing, and I'll explain in a bit why. There's also some in Brazil, and then there's the Asian side with Indonesia and some other Asian countries. Okay, so next, what is bean to bar? So the idea of bean to bar is basically how is chocolate produced? How does it become a bar from a bean? So this is the process through which beans go through. As compared to other commodities, it's a very complicated process. There's a lot of actors, there's a lot of processes. And basically, you can see here the cocoa pod is first harvested, then it's cleaned, fermented, and dried. Then it goes into roasting. Once it's been roasted, it's grinded. Then it's pressed, it's mixed. Then there's this process which was created by mint. And conching is basically you soften the mixture, and then you eventually end up with a chocolate bar. This is a very, very simplified process. One thing I've tried to indicate in the slide is the milk chocolate color here. So pressing, mixing, conching, and chocolate. Those are the processes that add the value to the chocolate bar. So it's very much like the coffee coffee process where the roasting of the bean adds value. Here, it's the pressing, mixing, crunching, and eventually chocolate that add the value. And it's important to keep this in mind because these processes, these last processes happen by the chocolate manufacturers. Usually the first two are done by farmers, and then roasting and grinding are sometimes done either by the farmers or by the traders, as like the ones who are like the intermediaries. But yeah, that's sort of how these become bars. Okay. I'll now highlight some of the challenges for the chocolate supply chain. Some things to keep in mind is that most of these challenges happen at the local level, so at the farmer level. So if we go to the next slide. Okay, the first challenges I've sort of investigated in the cocoa supply chain are the environmental ones. There's a lot of issues on pests and diseases, so there's also a history of how the cocoa beans got transferred from Brazil, because Brazil was a big market, into West Africa due to some pests in the plantations. There's obviously the concern with aging plantations, specifically in West Africa, and then that's why I highlighted Ecuador, because now they're trying to see where cocoa can be grown and to diversify that, and obviously on plant yield. So as you have aging plantations, obviously you're not going to get as many pods per plant. There's issues on monoculture and lack of plant diversification, which is also tied to all these other problems on like eroded soils. You have deforestation, biodiversity loss, and then there's water stress. There's also some social problems. So in the early 2000s, there was this documentary on child labor in the cocoa industry. There's also been allegations of forced labor. There's poor working conditions for the farmers. Specifically for farmers, there's issues on land rights. So the next issue is the small scale farming, and this is very important because a lot of cocoa, about 90 to 95%, is done on small scale farms, which means that in a shipment you can have 70 farmers contributing to the shipment. So that means you can't really trace back a pod to its origin because of this, but also because there's a lot of small scale farmers. There's a lack of standardization in what is required for each farm, and also you're dealing with a lot of actors at the local level. Economically, there's some other challenges. So price setting is an important one because price setting is usually done at the international level. There's 3 stock exchanges. There's the Chicago, London, and New York exchanges where cocoa is traded. So price is dependent on this market. The International Cocoa Organization does all the like the statistics on the price, and then it evaluates sort of what to look for in the cocoa. Locally, farmers, because of the political situation of the countries that they're in, being either Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Ecuador, there's limited access to credit. So obviously, they can only, at a certain point, dedicate their time to just growing the beans. This, I think, is a problem with commodities in general, is the low incomes and profits that farmers can make out of growing these commodities. And then related to the price setting, though farmers don't necessarily get a higher price or a price that is equal to the market price for the beans. Okay, so for this paper, it was my first attempt at it. It was for Lisa's class actually, so you'll hear this twice. And everybody who's going to be in my defense will hear it twice as well. But I've sort of highlighted 3 things that I wanted to use as a theoretical background. So first is this idea of liberal environmentalism. So what I mean by this, or actually what Bernstein refers to as liberal environmentalism, is that we do have a liberal order, and this is where the cocoa industry is sort of working in, the order that it's working in. And by liberal environmentalism, it's basically embedding these like environmental protection rules in the liberal order, either in trade or in finance. And as you'll see later, this ties in sort of with what I wanted to do and on the voluntary sustainability initiatives. Then adding on to that, I have, sorry, 2 more. Yeah, I had it all on Canva and it looked nicer, but anyway. Next one. Yeah, so on sustainable development, This is a term that's been used for a while now. It was, in the UN starting in the 80s, and now it's become, I think, more, more used, I think. So it adds on to this idea of liberal environmentalism, but it adds this social and economic aspects, and I think this will help in my analysis of the sustainability initiatives. And then I have big brand sustainability, which I'm happy and sad that Peter Granger is not here. He's on his sabbatical, but this big brand sustainability is the Vernon Lister's idea of thinking of how there's been sustainability efforts that have been embedded across brands and big companies, and then how they've been using logos or brands to add this sustainability, but also to add value for customers to identify a certain brand with a certain sustainability sort of initiative. What they do argue is that this is not done because companies are moral and they want to be this like environmental champion. It's mostly to reduce costs. But again, there is a lot happening in terms of making brands sort of sustainable. Okay. So, sorry for all the clicking. So what I want to do is, based on this theoretical background, especially on the big brand sustainability by Vernon Lister, I wanted to do the same sort of mapping out of the chocolate manufacturing companies and see whether or not they are trying to create voluntary sustainability initiatives, and basically this being the bar that they've sort of championed for. So in the next slide, we see I've decided to pick the top 8 companies. So for 2 reasons, I'm also focusing on companies because I think they have first the most power in branding the chocolate industry, and also on the top 8 because otherwise the research would be too long. So this is information from the International Cocoa Organization that they have this based on net sales. So you can see some familiar companies here: Mars, obviously Snickers, Mars bars, Milky Ways, Ferrero Group, based in Luxembourg and in Italy. They do Ferrero Rocher and some other, I forgot, Rafaelos. Then there's Mondelez, which is based in the US. They do Cadbury and Toblerone. Meiji is a Japanese company. They do Meiji chocolate bars and other cookies with chocolate fillings. I've never tried them. Then we have Hershey's, of course, Kisses, Hershey bars. And in the US, I learned through my research, they also do Kit Kat, just in the US, because otherwise Kit Kat is Nestle. I'm learning. And then we have Nestle, which is a Swiss company. They do Kit Kat, Aero, and the coffee crunch, and there's a coffee crisp. Yeah,
I know.
Yeah. Then we have Pladis. I'll talk about this one because this one is a fairly new company. It's actually a new company in the sense that it was splintered off another company that was called Yildiz Holdings, which is a Turkish company, but they decided to have their chocolate division separate from the rest of their confectionery. So this one is based in the UK, and they do Godiva chocolate. And then, of course, they've been familiar that do the chocolate bars, but also the Lindor, and in the US, they have Voluntary. Okay, so next slide. So with these companies, I wanted to look at their sustainability initiatives. And okay, so I've tried to, if this table looks familiar, it's because it's a copy of the Vernon Lister's, except that I've done it with chocolate and with the, their plans and strategies. So a few things to note here is that obviously we see that all of them have goals. The only exception here is Pladis. As I mentioned, it's a new company. It was only registered as a company in 2019. They do have a report. So you can see here the year is last year, 2022. The reason they don't have any goals is because they're working on their reporting. So, but it's interesting because you can see that the industry as a whole is pressuring this sort of initiative, these sustainability initiatives, because even though they don't have any goals, in their report they do mention that they're working on further reporting. So it is becoming sort of a move that the industry is trying to do. Second, here Ferrero is 2019. One thing to note is that actually their first report came out in 2013, but it was a CSR, so it was a corporate social responsibility report. It was not what it now being branded as this for the better report, which is a environment, social governance reporting. So it just comes to show that they are expanding on this idea of being sustainable, encompassing more issues, and you can see it from their goals. So it's basically sourcing the ingredients sustainably, protecting the environment, promote responsible consumption, and empower people. And across all of them, we see either a mention of the environment, something about their ingredients, and there's also an idea of also thinking about like human rights or any other social aspects involved in the supply chain of chocolate. So these are my preliminary findings. It's not a lot because obviously like all the reports have different things. So I'll go to the next slide. Okay, so in my paper I've identified 6 limitations, not just because of space, but basically I did not identify whether or not these strategies are successful or if they've been a failure at addressing at least the challenges that the chocolate supply chain has. Second, I didn't explain if there's any divergences in the voluntary sustainable initiatives or why these divergences exist. Third, I do identify that there is certification of the cocoa supply chain in the paper. So there's 3 types of certificates. There's fair trade, there's UTC, and there's the Forest Alliance. But I didn't identify whether this had any impact in companies deciding to do their own BSIs or just opting for using the third-party certification. Some of them do have like the certification as part of their partnerships, but I didn't identify any of this. Then I also didn't identify whether the companies are embedding sustainable development goals into their strategies. So for example, Meiji, although they have their own strategy, most of it comes from the sustainable development goals, whereas the others do mention them, but they're not necessarily pillars to their strategies. Fifth, I didn't talk about any of the international organizations. I mean, I talked about the International Cocoa Organization, but there's also the World Cocoa Foundation and the International Cocoa Initiative, which also deal with social issues related to the cocoa industry, but also bring countries to the table, especially exporter and importer countries, and then also the relationship with other companies, with other NGOs. And lastly, I didn't talk about the regulatory environment to see whether any of the initiatives are or any divergences are caused because of where the company is located and whether they have any impact on the initiatives that the company decides to use. And I mean, I know there's a lot more that I missed, so these are just what I could think of as I was writing the paper, so I'm happy to hear what else I missed. And yeah, that's it.
Okay, let's turn it over right away to Lisa for stuff.
Should I sit here?
I can actually just turn the camera to you if you like.
Okay, great. So, let's see. Really fascinating set of papers. I have to say, I drew the lucky straw in having 2 of the papers are actually papers for my class, which I'm still in the midst of marking. So, guilty birds with that stuff. That's great.
And then there was
And then all 3 of you were in my class, so it's just a pleasure to. It's not the ones in my class. I also want to praise all 3 of you for stepping outside of the bounds of mainstream political science topics and being brave enough to do that. You know, all 3 of you are so that's fantastic. I think that there can be huge payoffs to doing that, but it also takes a lot of courage to choose topics like this and to defend them in front of all the mainstream political scientists around you who may be But I think they're super valuable and interesting and definitely fit within what we care about in science topics. So you're all sharing a focus on non-state actors in global politics or even galactic politics, but in different ways. So Thomas's paper is really focused on kind of non-state sports organization, FIFA, and the politics of its activities, largely beyond governments or even international organizations' control. But this seems to be changing a little bit in terms of legal liabilities of FIFA at the time. Catherine's paper is about the environmental, labor, and human rights responsibilities of corporations in the chocolate industry. Some of these obligations are embedded in state laws, depending where the activities occur, but much of it is being shaped by wider social and consumer demands for corporations to uphold certain standards of ethical behavior. And that can push corporations to some extent, and this applies to FIFA as well, to exceed what the bare minimum legal requirements for them are that are state-based. And then Phil's paper is about what states and non-state actors and experts in civil society, regular citizens, should do to prepare for the possible event that extraterrestrial life and beings will be proven to exist, or that we actually have physical contact on Earth or by humans who are traveling in outer space. So in all of these cases, these papers are emphasizing for us how phenomena in international politics are changing and how we need to use different lenses that are not based solely on interstate relations to understand issues that are affecting or might affect people's lives in specific ways. And you're all focusing, I think, interestingly, on phenomena where, or issues where international law on these things is actually quite embryonic or non-existent or unclear as to how different actors should behave and what their obligations are. Okay, so this is how the papers all fit together. Now I'm going to turn to each paper in turn, and I'll just briefly talk about Phil's paper first because I have the least to say about it because I don't really know anything at all about this topic. It's way out of my area of knowledge. And I mostly learn a lot from the paper, so that's great. So I have to say, when I saw the title of the paper and I planned to read it, at first I thought, okay, this is going to be totally weird and implausible. It's going to be one of those out there related topics. But actually reading it, it's really worth reading. And I really encourage you to continue with it because I do think it's very fruitful. I actually find it made a really compelling case that we do need to prepare for the possibility of contact with extraterrestrial life. And we do need to try, as hard as it is to really plan for these things, we do need to kind of try to forecast what kinds of principles states, scientific groups can agree upon about what to do if and when it does happen. I was really persuaded that the possibilities for disaster and terrible outcomes if we don't plan for this are pretty significant. Like it's one of those, it might be a black swan thing where it is highly unlikely. I don't think it is.
No.
Highly unlikely, but if it happens, we want to be ready. But you can avoid a lot of disaster simply through, if you can manage to find a way for different actors to coordinate with one another and organized in advance for certain situations. So who has, you pointed them out on that lovely slide, some of these things. Who has the rights and obligations to report? What are the transparency obligations of governments to reveal instead of hiding what they found? So this is coming straight out of my 1990s X-Files brain. How governments can or should cooperate when they're planning responses into different scenarios. This is all super important. So I encourage you to carry on with it, and it sounds like you will be. I just have one question about something that wasn't clear. It's not really, it's just a fact question, which is this NASA chief scientist who made this statement that you have right at near the top on page 2 about the timelines of evidence that we're likely to see. So what I wasn't clear of was, were you saying that she expects the world will have strong evidence that there is life beyond Earth in the next 10 years? Or that we'll know whether or not, in the next 10 years, we'll know whether or not? In other words, is she saying like, yeah, we know life is out there, we just don't quite have enough evidence yet? Or is she saying the question will be settled?
If I understood well what she said during the conference, it was during the conference she said that. And in fact, there were other reports that supported that. It's that we actually will find strong evidence of extraterrestrial life. It's not like we will reject this. Like it becomes, from what I come to understand, it becomes more and more consensual in the scientific sphere that there will be actually a discovery of extraterrestrial life. They think it actually exists. Then the question is, when are we going to discover that? Obviously, I'm not like, I don't have any opinion on that in the sense that I don't know about it. I'm not in, I'm not in this field, but I really got like, how shall I say it? I really added up many scientists that seem to support the fact that there exists, like extraterrestrial life exists, but then it's when, if someday we're going to discover it. It's a matter of time. Yeah.
Mathematically know that.
Yeah, this is what I came to understand, and this is what the NASA head scientists seem to suggest.
Okay, that was very interesting. That's good. Okay, so that's all I have to say. So secondly, Katherine's paper, also a very cool line of research. There's a lot of promise. So you just started, kind of gathered all this data, and you're struggling to figure out what you should do with it or how to present it. But I think there's a lot of promising directions you could go in. Okay, so one thing I would say just about sort of the way you're outlining concepts is, one thing I wasn't really clear on is that you were drawing a line of distinction, which you didn't talk about much in the presentation, distinction between third-party certification and voluntary sustainability initiatives. And I thought, the way you discussed it was a bit confusing to me. I thought you were suggesting that voluntary sustainability initiatives are distinct in that they're voluntary. The third-party certification is also voluntary, in the sense that it's a private, it's a private initiative that companies choose to either certify and be monitored by them or not. They could presumably exit it if they want to, although that would be reputationally not a good thing to do. But it's still voluntary, like it's not regulation, it's not government regulation. So I thought that was a little bit confusing. What I would say is probably the big difference, if I'm understanding BSIs properly, is that they're all kind of created by the companies themselves, or at least portions of the industry itself. So it isn't an arm's length independent third-party monitoring institution, it's more self-monitoring. In other words, it's like the boxes. So it's a lower bar. I think that's what the difference is, but we can talk about that later. Another thing is that I found, okay, so when I looked at that table 2 that you had that sort of mimicked the Divert and Lister table, it looked to me, you didn't talk much about this, but it looked to me like Mondelez may have the most substantial and detailed program. I don't know if that's true or not. I'd love to hear more about it. You don't really say anything about that. And also, I've noticed the variation among the different countries in what they focus on. So Mondelez in particular seems to be more focused on human rights and labor standards and fair trade than on environmental standards, for example. And that led me to think, and we talked about this a little bit before, I think there's a lot for you to gain by focusing on the differences among the companies in the issues that they're focusing on. So why are some focused on environment more versus others focused on women's empowerment, for example, or nutritional standards of the ingredients? I think it would be really fruitful to look into the history of that. So what's the history, what's the path that leads these different companies to have different kinds of standards? Towards the end of the paper and in your conclusion slide here, I think you were pointing to a lot of things that would perhaps, like one way you might go about this is really aiming to explain the divergence among the company's strategies. And maybe some of these other things you were raising as limitations of things you haven't looked at, they might be explanatory factors. So the extent to which they're paying attention to or in dialogue with international organizations, or is it stakeholder groups and would come to them? What countries or specific communities are they working in? So there are all kinds of things that you could look at, which could be a way to go for your thesis, because it's not requiring you to say how effective the actual policies are. That's much more of a research long-term project. But accounting for what the differences in policies are might be really, really interesting. Okay, and then Thomas's paper, I also super promising start. We've talked a lot about this and a million directions we thought you could go with it. I personally have always had sort of a latent interest, casual interest in international sport politics for a couple of reasons. One is that I once had a postdoctoral fellow I supervised who was a kinesiologist and a sociologist. But her work was on gender in sport for development policy, so that was kind of the NGO gender. And I just found the politics of that really, really fascinating, and I would encourage you maybe to look a bit into that literature about sport for development, human rights kind of sociology. That might help. The other reason is that when I was writing this book with Laura Henry about BRICS, NGOs, and global governance, we were also really struck by how obvious it was that the BRICS states in particular seem to really have a thing about bidding to host major global sporting events, and how this is closely related to building state prestige, reputation, pride of the nation in the country, in these kind of rising or declining power states. And it seemed really obvious, like it just jumped right out to us. Anyway, in terms of your paper, I do think you could dig into some other related literature. So there's the Sport for Development literature, which might be helpful. But also there is more literature on the politics of international sporting federations. So there's a fair amount of literature now on the Olympics and the politics, the IOC. And your literature right now that you're citing is fairly thin, so I think you can really use that a lot for context, because there are a lot of similar issues going on with that. Also, we've talked about this before, but you have this really fascinating breakdown of the different ways that we can think about FIFA as an organization. And you kind of laid that out in your presentation. I think there's one category you might be missing from the literature, which is there is a kind of small literature on informal international organizations. So Charlie Roger, who graduated from this department, has written a lot on that, and it might be helpful. So where there isn't a secretariat, there isn't like a specified annual meeting, but there are these informal groups. He only focuses really on state-based, government-based actors, but I think there's an analogy there too. Or literature on intergovernmental networks that aren't national governments. So Anne-Marie Slaughter's previous work on this, for example. And I can send you some references on that later. I do think what you don't get into enough in that discussion, which is I think the most interesting part, is FIFA's use of that slipperiness or that hybrid status that it has, where sometimes it's an association.
For profit.
Sometimes it's a company, basically, international corporation. Sometimes it's a confederation of local sporting organizations, and in different scenarios it refers, I think, it's supposed to be that I think it refers to itself in whatever way is useful at that moment. I think you could get into that a little bit more. In the empirical analysis that I just started to get into of the Rugging report and how FIFA has responded, I'd love to see more detail on how FIFA's human rights, more detail on how the human rights policy now operates in practice. So, for example, one thing that really jumped out at me was you talk about its engagements with CSOs and communities, or at-risk communities. What does that look like in practice? What can you find about that? How sustained are these interactions? How substantive are they? Have they led to, through conversation, modifications in how FIFA and its contractors are operating? So I think there's a whole world of possible research to be done on that, which could mean more than you're able to do in the master's thesis of doing international research.
We need the department wants to give them money.
Exactly. More time, more money. In terms of policy recommendations, I did wonder, so I'd love to learn more about this grievance process. You briefly talked about it being related to the Court of Arbitration. I'd love to know more about how it works in practice. Like, my initial thought was, wait a minute, it seemed to me, until I saw those three words, Court of Arbitration, it seemed to be it's almost an internal thing where, how hands-off is it? Ideally, as a recommendation, wouldn't a good one be to take the evaluation or the collection of grievances and the investigation of them out of FIFA's hands, or any of FIFA's control over it, and put it into the hands of an independent third party? So these are all great papers, and thank you so much for them.
Thank you, Lisa.
Those are fantastic, rich comments, and I think given the differences across these three presentations, what might be most useful is maybe if you folks want to take a minute or two to respond to some missed comments, questions that you posed throughout those remarks, and then maybe we open it up to question and answer, both virtually and in person, if that works for everyone. If somebody is wanting to start us off.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. It wasn't clear on the third party and the VSIs, because originally I was thinking of focusing or making the distinction between what is a voluntary sustainable initiative and what is a certification, sort of the fair trade, UTC, and the Forest Alliance. Yes, I think it's important to keep in mind that they are voluntary as well as the voluntary sustainability initiatives, but I think the difference then comes from the VSIs being part of the company and what their goals are, rather than just signing on to have the certificate be in the label of the product. And I think that goes back to the comment that you made on the history, or like the path that led the companies to opt, rather than just using the third party certifications, to actually create their own sustainability initiative. So thank you very much for the comments. I think, I don't know, it's a lot, and like it took me a while to come up with something. But yeah, it's a lot.
Okay. I don't have much to add to what you just said, but thank you very much, Lisa, for your comments. I just went back to see to make sure that what I was saying about the head scientist was like was true, which I thought, but it is indeed, like it says that there will be strong indications of alien life within a decade and definite evidence of it within 20 to 30 years. This is what it's said. Otherwise, I just want to thank you for your trust in the topic, because I felt like for the past months I've got to defend this just the existence of this topic. So I'm happy that you actually kind of recognize that there is to unveil, and definitely I think I will have to in some way in my thesis to kind of support the relevance of what I'm writing. But yeah, thank you.
You already do a pretty good job. I mean, you could forefront it more, but that's partly what persuaded me. You're like, yeah, we all think this is a crazy idea, and we don't really know if it's ever gonna happen, but there are things we can do.
Yeah, as I said, people will already see my name and be like, it could be about China and the US, and people will be like, what am I gonna read? But thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, for your comments. Just quickly on the literature I just started reading a paper on the use of megasport events by autocracies and the international scrutiny that comes with it, and how autocracy have adapted their repressive regimes according to this event. So there's a lot I still want to explore on this very multifaceted type of politics that is sport. For the HR policy in practice, for the final paper, I kind of was blocked with it. I thought I wanted to, because I didn't see that all the allegations for FIFA with the Qatar World Cup infrastructure, as soon as Qatar adopted its 2017 human rights policy, there's been no longer any talk about the World Cup in Qatar being violent against migrants. And lastly, for the grievance mechanism, I wanted, that's what we talked about before, to do like this internal thing, but I was conflicted because Ruggie was saying that it has to be internal.
Oh.
So maybe, and I didn't feel yet legitimate to criticize John Ruggie. So maybe that's something I could explore for even more to see why he went that way, why internal Ruggie.
Well, it could have something to do with the fact that Ruggie's a real fan of kind of normative socialization rather than punishment, having normative, just persuasion and socialization over time. So that might be a reason why you say make it internal, so the outside world is not shaming you for what you're doing necessarily. But I don't know if I'm convinced.
Yeah.
Okay, questions from the others. Let's go to, I'm gonna go to Kim first if that's okay, and that's one then to you.
Yes, thank you very much, everyone. I have two questions. First, to Phil, a very nice project. I loved the topic. I don't know why people said it wasn't, like, it's super great, especially the data for it. I think this is a very convincing argument, like who has access to this data. If that's an avenue you're gonna take for your thesis, I think it's great. But the policy kind of coordination problem you highlight and you kind of want to pursue. Again, we've talked about this a bit, but I think that one avenue that could be interesting, or like some portion of your thesis could look at, like, what are the current mechanisms from information sharing and coordination when we're faced with big global crisis, in a sense, or for like big events that haven't happened before. And I'm thinking like COVID, we've seen like the beginning of COVID. How is the coordination, the information sharing and all of that? I think it could be interesting to draw like a parallel. Katherine, great presentation. I'm a big skeptic about CSR policies in general. And just to draw a quick parallel here with the garment industry. So we see that the big corporation, they really want to keep the profit, of course. And like in Bangladesh, what we see is like they subcontract companies, and then these companies, they put pressure on the workers. So even though there's a lot of CSR that they're being adopted, and these companies, they push you with a lot of like sustainability, corporate social responsibility when you go into the store. And in reality, we see that like in 2013, Rana Plaza collapse and all of that. So we don't really see a change for the workers. So I know you might not have time to explore this in your thesis, but like, I was curious about, you quickly mentioned the middle person and like the one who are vest and the big companies, but what is the role of this middle person in kind of like enhancing that, like very much applying what are the big companies pushing for, or like mediating this kind of thing to really leave the worker? I'm sorry, you understand what I mean? I just can't express it for that. But yeah, like what is the role of these middle person? Like, what do they do in this?
Okay. Wait, so one thing, when I started writing about this chocolate thing, I was like, I don't want to be disillusioned by chocolate, I love it too much. So yes, I do understand why there's this skepticism. I mean, it's what, like the Varian investors say when it comes to big brand sustainability. It might just be adding a title so you get more customers. And however, and that's what I wanted to sort of look at. I think that could be for the pieces. I wanted to look at the challenges and to see whether the companies actually address the challenges that are in the cocoa supply chain. So for example, if they have any programs for a lot focus on, for example, opportunities for women and women equality. So to say, okay, they do have a mention on this. Obviously, it's not going to tell me whether they put it into practice, but most of them do have like goals of like energy efficiency by 2050, let's say, and they do have like progress reports. Obviously, it's to be taken with a grain of salt because if they do their internal reporting, how valid can the information be? So yes, I mean, I don't want to be skeptical. I love chocolate, but yeah, definitely, I take your comment. And on the mediator, there is a paper that actually looks at their role in the supply chain. So basically, the farmers don't like send off the beans. Actually, somebody comes, picks them up, and then they are the ones responsible. I mean, obviously not taking into the international market, but you know, this happens fictionally. But yeah, that's their role. And then in terms of companies coming into the places, again, they have a lot of initiatives and programs at the local level. So I think that would be one way of measuring whether or not they're having impact at the local level, to see if these programs are being set, who's participating. I know in my paper I mentioned it, Cabello and Mars. If you go to their, I think it was Mars. If you go to their like websites, they have an interactive map. Well, no, Ferrero has a list of all the farmers, and then Mars has an interactive map where you can see what are, and also like the initiatives that they put in place locally. So it would be, I mean, without going to the field, one way of capturing the extent of their effort.
I love how we're both talking about Mars.
and the Milky Way.
Yeah, the Milky Way, exactly. Oh, no, well, no, I didn't have much to, no, I didn't.
That's such an interesting question though,
But-
could we have a general crisis management
Well,
international?
it's exactly like it's because Kim and I already discussed about that. But yeah, I think I would definitely have to focus on more of a, because I think that for COVID, for example, it was the World Health Organization, and but I would have to look at if there's been some crisis in like the space field, maybe I don't know.
That's right.
Yeah, it's a.
That you have to
Definitely, there's something to dig into that.
Yeah, it was mostly about like the coordination problem that we see, where even
Yes.
though it doesn't concern the same subject, we're likely to see these again because like the interest in power is like,
Yeah, totally.
they're gonna
totally.
be the same.
You're right, totally
Yeah.
right. Thank you very much.
Great. I'll try to ask each of you questions. So starting with Thomas, thank you. That was very interesting. I watched the last World Cup.
Like 1 billion people.
Yeah, and like many people, I think I began to pay attention to the kind of the importance of human rights in FIFA, or with the Qatar World Cup. It's frankly still a bit surprising to me. I was surprised related to the John Ruggie report came in 2017, 16. So that's kind of like like even before the Russia World Cup. When you think of FIFA, you think of corruption. You think of like older, more kind of ancient vices, rather than something like human rights kind of abuse. And that is an interesting story to be told. How FIFA, something like FIFA, who is known for basically firstly kind of say uneven global distribution of resources, kind of like the Qatar World Cup also a story of quite massive corruption. So anyways, how human rights became so central to it, central to FIFA, I think is a story kind of like worth exploring a little bit. And human rights, it's a very, there's a lot of scholarship on human rights. It's a it's actually poses more questions than answers, especially as a kind of way of kind of think of any kind of particular agenda or policies, global scope, is kind of always mired in all sorts of problems. I mean, it often becomes a code word, a byword for dealing with the global south. A political issue becomes a matter of human rights, but it is, I mean, you might find, for example, the stuff that Samuel Moyn wrote, on different contexts, or how things like, say, from anti-colonialism to kind of like, different kind of, things that you would not call human rights. We start calling all of them human rights these days. It's probably not necessarily central to your paper, but worth thinking about, right? How could something like FIFA become like a kind of a poster child for human rights kind of abuse in our time? So anyway, we're interested to hear if you have any thoughts on this, but I also want to ask you, I don't know that like there's also some debate about the legal person of FIFA, right? Is it a kind of a non-profit kind of like, or is it an international organization? So these are, it's a fascinating debate, it seems like. But how basically do these kind of classifications, how do they relate to the question of human rights? I wanted to hear a little bit more. What's the stake of how we categorize FIFA as to what kind of like human rights responsibilities would be imposed on them, right? Anyway, so I'd love to hear some thoughts if you have come across anything. Feel that's very interesting. It's always fun to hear paper on this, and your paper made me think of okay, so you have this extraterrestrial, like aliens, whatever. It seems to always bring to the fore the question of global governance. It's in the movies, it's everywhere. So movies, of course, it all comes down to the American president, but you see them making some frantic phone calls, right? So at least that's there. But I guess. So this is on the question I'm thinking more from the kind of context of the Anthropocene literature, right? There is this kind of, some people are looking at the kind of problem that what the kind of Anthropocene is making us see that this is not just a globe, right? But also a planet. We have a planetary existence along with maybe our global existence. Global is a much more human, more kind of, something that is more historical and something human construct. A planet, of course, you have to understand it to comparative planetology or whatever. It is a kind of problem beyond just how we think about, say, global governance, right? And something like ET seems to, it really brings this question to the fore, our identity as a planet, right? But we try to get to it through global governance, things that are maybe kind of put in place for dealing with, more terrestrial problems, So whether you feel the question of extraterrestrial kind of like, life, whether is it even containable at all within the global governance framework, or what way is it kind of stretching that framework, right? If you have any thoughts on this, just hear this. Katherine, so also very interesting, and I had no idea about like, all these different, which chocolate company kind of like markets were like, and the thing about KitKat was quite interesting. So I was thinking partly about the whole idea of sustainable development, this is in your paper, right? So all these 10 companies you selected, or these are companies I guess you don't select, these are the top 10 companies in terms of the global distribution and sales, right? And all of them appear to be kind of based in Europe or North America. But do all of them cater to the global market equally? There's a huge market also in the global south. Who are kind of supplying chocolates in those areas, right? This is something that I was trying to.
I can answer that quickly.
Yeah. Sure.
So actually, the consumption is North America and Europe. So it's one of the things that is also very interesting for cocoa is that it's not consumed locally when it's raw. So West African consumption is like zero.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh.
And that's changing because obviously now they want to bring the production back to where it's being grown, but it's 50% of consumption is North America and Europe.
Interesting. I would imagine chocolate is globally kind of
Well,
popular.
there's this book called The Economics of Chocolate, and they do have a chapter on how it's moving from North America, Europe to China. So China is becoming a big market for chocolate.
Interesting.
But the biggest right now if you look at statistics, I couldn't find like on consumption because it was hard, but you have like Switzerland as the number one.
Yeah.
You have Germany, the US, and then the case of China that is growing in
Yeah.
consumption.
Yeah, no, so I mean, interesting. So I was, so you see this story that you presented, right? It does raise, I think, some questions about the whole idea of sustainable development. Sustainable development is what you're thinking about in terms of maybe not destroying the environment, or that to an extent makes sense. But in terms of development largely construed, the way people thought about development, say in the 20th century, it had to do with, like, you are, supposed to have some level increase their productive capacity. This is how, say, kind of like development primarily had more national economic reference. Then World Bank, IMF, or the Bretton Woods institution came, but they still kind of retained a connection to that kind of like, just like building the future, as it were. These companies, when we talk about sustainable development, okay, I see one example maybe as kind of like, something that, that the example of Rana Plaza is interesting, right? I mean, it's what way, for example, this garments industry kind of developing economy. Well, means they would often bring up gender balance, stuff like that. So these are kind of like, in many ways, developing, I guess, in other senses, right? Yeah, so, and part of this is also about, but in terms of like, do they take any initiative to kind of say, in more standard traditional economic terms of development, ensuring that, for example, that some of the profit stays in the country, right? In a way that like the industry being developed, and I mean, are these at all part of the discourse of sustainable development, or it's just primarily environment and maybe other kind of new indices of kind of like, development, like gender equality? And I mean, that part was, to me, was not very clear, right? I'd be keen to hear, if you have any kind of thoughts on this, but really interesting cover.
I can quickly start. So what I wanted to show with this use of human rights was that if we actually just look at FIFA and what they're doing with human rights, it actually shows how they see themselves as a private actor. But what is interesting is that they do also use their legal status in this human right, in those human rights questions, where they do use this idea of being a non-profit organization to show that what they're advancing is an ideal. It's a non-profit. We are defending non-for-profit cause. We're doing something without profit, but they also use this non-profit organization to receive tax cut. So, in the sense, they are making big profits and they are adding tax cut on this. So I hear that there's a lot of talk on FIFA and corruption, and there was just too many papers on this. There's a documentary on Netflix on it, so I was like, this is done. I don't want to do this. So I actually thought when I was starting the project that FIFA was going to do terrible. But it actually depends on what we consider as human rights, I believe so. Because as you said, there's what are considered human rights. Like if we would put LGBTQ rights into a human right, we would see that FIFA is doing terrible with the recent World Cup. But if we just look at labor rights, child labor, they're actually doing good on this sense. So I think what maybe is missing in my paper is actually narrowing the scope of what I mean by human rights, like what I leave out and what I include. And I appreciate you for this, the comment for that.
I appreciate as well your comments, and your question was actually really, really relevant. Obviously, like, my paper couldn't explore on how we would settle a governance, a like universal governance with extraterrestrials. I guess the approach we would take as humans would be the state-centered global governance approach. But then, obviously, it doesn't mean that we can't try to include within the framework we're trying to structure a kind of way to approach power dynamics with these extraterrestrial life. If we can find, obviously it's highly speculative, but I mean, it's not, I mean, better be safe than sorry, and trying to like settle a way to find this power dynamic. And otherwise, I feel like, yeah, you have an interesting take on Anthropocene. Anthropocene, yeah. The fact that also I feel like maybe we started thinking, at least like the literature I see on extraterrestrials, there was a numbers of texts that were coming from the Cold War era. So when we started really dreaming about space, and I feel like it comes back a bit right now, not because we have this Cold War dream, but because we're thinking about the end of our planet. So we're thinking about what's happening elsewhere. So I wanted to thank you.
And thank you for the comments, especially on the sustainable development. I think it goes back to the point on the certificates, because if you think about fair trade, obviously you think of the price premium that is being sort of kept in at the local level, whereas the VSIs probably just have a program that is not necessarily for profit, but it's for, I mean, that type of growth. So maybe the distinction should be there on what the certificates are the voluntary sustainability initiatives are trying to do at the local level. I know, like, from reading some of the reports, they do address, for example, providing opportunities for women, or they do talk a lot specifically because of the documentary that came out in the 2000s on child labor and how to increase education. But yeah, I think that should be a bit clearer in the distinction of the companies.
Fantastic. I want to give the last question to Elijah before we break for the day. I recognize that we're just past time, but this is such a generative panel. It's such interesting ideas, so I'm not shocked. We're running a few minutes earlier, but over to you, Elijah.
Yeah, I'll try and keep it short. I had a question for Catherine, and I think it might just follow along some of the same lines of things that were raised earlier, so feel free to just shut it down. But I thought it was very thought-provoking, and so what I sort of was thinking about too was sort of like how certain initiatives arise from like the sort of need to keep sustainable development within sort of like a profit-growing motive, and so then like how then does something like including different provisions for like human rights or like the involvement of women sort of correspond with local, like actual local initiatives, I guess. I think maybe I'm living too much in the example of the sort of thing I'm going to be presented on tomorrow. But like I'm wondering if I guess certain versions of human rights are sort of displaced by those that might be more favorable to sort of large corporations and various practices which might, involve, aspirations to equality or something like this, could get displaced by like a more individual human rights sort of narrative, I guess is what I'm getting at. So I don't know if this sort of is just asking a similar thing, but I think that's what I was curious about.
Yeah, I think that's sort of the point that Laverne was and Mr. were making, right? That obviously the sustainability initiatives by companies might not, and I think that's what I want to get at eventually, having like a list of the challenges and then saying, okay, they are actually addressing the challenges that are important for the cocoa industry, such as opportunities for women or child labor, which is a big, like, I think that's the main one that they were concerned with. But I think there's a lot, especially in thinking about what are the gaps as well between local level, like what the governments at a local level have in terms of protection, for example, for child labor, and how come the company has to sort of abide, or not abide, but like embed some sort of protection and why the company and not the local government. I think that's what you're getting at, right? So
yeah,
the
sort
distinction.
Of. Yeah, like I'm even curious about like, I don't know, maybe this is going too far into it, but like sort of the initiative for sort of companies trying to grab land to then use to make their products, sort of following a state-led initiative for like a more individual human rights rather than collective human rights sort of framework of understanding human rights. And so I'm sort of wondering, even sort of in the definition of the goals themselves, if they sort of conform to one account of human rights or something like that.
Fantastic. That concludes the first day of the conference. Thank you again to all the panelists today. Thank you again to our discussants, Josh, and no longer here, but Lisa, that was fantastic to hear those rich comments, and I know that we'll support these three fantastic projects. Thank you again, Nazlo, for the incredible keynote this morning. It's recorded. If you weren't able to catch it. Incredibly interesting. I cannot wait to go read here personally. That's my summer plan. Tomorrow our day starts at 10:45. Was that right? 10:45. Same place, same time. We might make it a little easier for people to get here. But if you're running into anybody and they're wondering where the DSS loft is, you can tell them they stick us in the top corner of the top floor. A reminder that the after party is unfortunately canceled tomorrow. We are encouraging folks to come up to the beach social on the 13th, next Saturday. Graduate students, promises to be a really fun event for us to celebrate all of our accomplishments and our time together in Vancouver. So with that, enjoy the rest of your days, get home safe, try to stay dry, and we'll see you again tomorrow.